Hello everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to paint this cat eye in acrylics. Now before we get into the tutorial, I'd just like to mention that I have now launched my acrylic tier on Patreon. I'm really excited about this because I love working with this medium. That and pastels really are my passion, so I'm really excited to offer in-depth acrylic tutorials alongside my pastel as well. So if that Patreon channel is of interest to you, I'll link all of that information in the description below. Now, regardless of the eye that I'll be painting, regardless of the animal, even for humans as well, I will always block in with pupil and then I'll map in the iris, followed by that black line on the outside of that eyelid. Now, what I'm using here is a mixture of my Liquitex basics. They are certainly my paint of choice, and all I'm doing at the moment for the base layer stage is just blocking in a colour. I'm not really focusing on the exact colour at this stage, I'm just looking at where my lights and my darks are. Now the main bonus with acrylics is once that layer underneath is completely dry, we can cover it over entirely. So that's why at this stage I'm not really focusing on the exact colour. When I'm working with any medium, my main focus is my contrast, so my lights and my darks. However, obviously we want to make sure that we get the colour as close as we can. That being said, the main benefit with acrylics is that you can glaze so easily to adjust that colour where needed. So even when you're working on your base layer stage like what I am here, you don't have to be sort of spending all of that time worrying about mixing the exact colour. Just go for something close at this stage and you can then easily refine it later on. Now in my Patreon tutorials I do speak a lot about glazes because that's why I like using Liquitex basics. Where they do have that transparency to them, they work really well for glazes. If you come across any part of the painting and you realise that you needed to have it slightly cooler or warmer on the colour wheel for instance, or even a completely different colour, a glaze can change that very easily. Now I like to work in small sections regardless of the medium that I'm using, so while the iris is drying I'm now starting to block in the fur around it. You'll notice that even at this stage I'm pulling that brush in the direction that the fur is going to travel in. That's really important, and you can see here just how much depth I've already started to create within that fur under the eye, and that is only my very first layer. That's because I've made sure that I'm moving that brush in the direction that that fur is going to be travelling in when I come to put my details on top. So with the iris here, this is my third layer I think it was, and I'm now just starting to add in those lighter yellows that you can see in my finished painting in the corner. Now what you want to be doing is working from what's furthest away from you and then building up from there. So what you would see in your reference photo as being the deepest part of the eye, that's what you want to be painting first, and then ignoring all of those lighter colours, because each additional layer that you add, you want to be going slightly lighter as you do so to build up the depth gradually. And this is exactly what I'm doing here, so it's very much a rinse and repeat process. I've mixed some of these darker greens and I'm starting to now replicate this sphere shape of the eye, making sure that I'm keeping towards the top edge and the right side of the eye to get that globe, that sphere effect that I really want to create to get that level of realism in this study. Now regardless of the eye that I am painting, I always want to make sure that I've got this shadow in place, because these shadows, especially at the top of the eye, are going to make the eye that much more realistic. Because the eye is slightly sunken in to the head, it's going to have that shadow, so we want to make sure that we capture that. Now one of the common complaints with acrylics is that they dry too fast. Now I personally like that about them. Oils was my primary medium many years ago, and I switched over from oils to acrylics because I found that the slow drying time with oils was hindering the pet portrait process. So I sort of tweaked those techniques and then started to learn with acrylics, and I haven't looked back. Now if you are struggling with the fast drying time, there are a couple of things that you can do to help slow that down. The main one is you can get yourself a fine mist sprayer bottle, fill that with water and occasionally give a light layer across the top of your canvas, and then you can keep that paint wet for longer. It will then enable you to then reapply another layer, and then should you need to, you can do wet on wet blending to get a really nice soft transition. Now this process here with the iris, you can see that I'm getting all of these lighter yellows and then blending them out really easily, but all of my layers underneath are completely dry and I'm not using a fine mist sprayer bottle at any point on this study. Now the way that I'm getting my blend in here is by having two brushes on the go at the same time. I've got one loaded with paint and the other one that's clean with just a small amount of water. And as you can see from how I'm getting this glassy effect of the eye, it works really nicely. This is my preferred technique for blending my acrylics. Because I like working in small sections, I think this is why I favour this technique more so than using a fine mist spray bottle. That being said, if I wanted to do wet on wet blending, I would not hesitate to use a fine mist spray bottle because that works really nicely. Anybody that has an airbrush can also use that just filled with water, and you can again apply a fine layer of water over the top and that will do the same thing. Now when you're working on the iris here, it's really important to study that photo. You'll see here that I'm really paying a lot of attention to these patterns within the eye. This is what's going to make the eye that much more realistic. The biggest thing to consider when we are working on these details is that none of my brush strokes are completely flat. They're not straight. They've all got a degree of curvature in them. That's going to help to follow that sphere effect of the eye, so we don't want there to be any straight lines. Anything in nature is not going to be straight. Even trees, they're not completely upright. They're going to be slanted to a degree. So we want to make sure that within the iris itself, like what I'm working on here, that there are no straight lines within the patterns, because what will happen is we'll end up creating more of a flatter effect with the eye, which is obviously not what we're going for. Now, even if I was working on a pet portrait and the eyes are considerably smaller, unlike this one here, this was a 4x6 study. If on a pet portrait your eyes are smaller on that painting, I still want to make sure that I'm getting a few things in place. I want that shadow at the top, I want to make sure that I've got my pupil in the right place and that I've got my highlights as bright as they need to be and that they're also in the right place. They're my three main aims. The reason why I say that is you might not actually be able to get enough space within your pet portrait to capture all of these intricate details within the iris like what I'm painting at the moment. The one thing that you will be able to do though is see your lights and your darks. So if I had a pet portrait and it was an 8x12 for instance, the eye might only be a centimetre big. So therefore I've got to be realistic with how much detail I'm going to be able to add within that eye. The one thing though that will be very noticeable is the pupil, the highlight and the shadow at the top of the eye. So they are my three main things when I'm working on pet portraits with a slightly smaller scale. Now also alongside all of those things, the most important thing as well is that you get the shape of the eye right. We want to make sure that the angle, the placement and how it's shaped, how open that eye is all going to be accurate to that photo. The eyes are the soul of that animal, so we want to make sure that we get this as close as we possibly can to that reference photo. It's the main reason why, regardless of the portrait that I'm working on, I always do the eyes first. And also throughout processes throughout the eyes, I will also reinforce the black edge around the outside of the eye, just like what I'm doing here, to make sure that throughout the entire process I've always got the shape of that eye accurate. My tutorials on Patreon are very in-depth. They've got thorough voiceovers throughout and I give you a full colour list and the paintbrushes that I'm using with each tutorial. And in terms of the brushes that I like to use, my preferred brand is the Dahlia and Rowney because I do think they are very versatile. They're really nice and soft. Considering I don't spend too much time cleaning my brushes, which I really should do, but I don't, they've lasted me many years. And typically this 3¼ inch flat brush is the largest brush that I will usually use when I'm painting any kind of fur. My preference is to certainly use more smaller brushes because I feel that I can be a lot more precise and accurate with my fur, even right from my base layer stages. You'll see that when I start building the fur in these areas here, that after I've used this flat brush, I'll switch over to my various rounds and a couple of my filberts if needed, so that I can make sure that I'm getting all of that softness, the intricate details as accurate as I possibly can. Now at the moment here, all of this is blending together because I was able to work with a thicker amount of paint, so therefore it was drying that much more slowly, so I was able to do a bit of wet on wet blending. While all of that area was drying, I was just then going to be working on the corner of the eye. Now these little bits on the inside of the eye here that sometimes have more of that pink and purple colour are really important to make sure that we don't forget these little details. These are what are going to make your painting that much more realistic and take it to the next level. Often there's a lot of reflections within the outer parts of the eyelid, so we want to make sure that although we've got the strong highlight across the iris here, that we also get all of those highlights on the black portion at the bottom of the eye as well. And this is where I'll start to refine everything. So I'll look at that reference photo and I'll see where the light is bouncing in that eye, where the shadows are, making sure that I've got the shape of the pupil correct, and just making sure that I've got that as good as I can possibly get it. And I may end up spending a couple more minutes tweaking bits here and there on the eye itself, but once I was happy with that, I then started painting the fur around it. Now when I'm painting fur, regardless of the animal, I like to use a few different brushes. The reason for that is I don't want all of my fur to look the same. I want to build up as much depth as I possibly can within that fur, and I do believe that that's achieved more realistically by getting different thicknesses of brush strokes and different lengths. And I like to achieve that in my paintings by using round brushes and also liner brushes for my fur details. Sometimes I'll start off with a smaller round brush and then I'll finish off with more of my liner brushes. I've got a couple that are 1 to 1.5 centimeters long, and then ones like the red handled brush here that I'm using that are maybe 1.5 inches long. I do think that that helps to give that extra level of depth to that fur because all of the brush strokes start to look slightly different to the one underneath it. Now obviously with a liner brush you do have that lovely luxury with that brush that depending on how much pressure you put on that brush you can create thicker lines, and if you keep that brush in contact with that canvas for longer you can create lovely long lines. So they are a really lovely versatile brush to use, but as I say, I like using a couple of different sizes to make sure that when I am painting fur like this, that I've got a really nice variety within those fur strokes that I'm painting. Now when we are painting fur, the aim is never to completely cover the layer underneath. We're always wanting to have some of that darker layer show through, and when I'm working on these lighter sort of areas here, I think that shows that perfectly. By allowing these darker base layers to show through in between these lighter brush strokes here, it helps to create all of that extra depth. Now when you get to the point where you're painting the area around the eye, really study that photo to make sure that you're getting that fur direction accurate. The fur direction is following the bone and muscular structure under the skin, so it's not random. If we don't have this fur travelling in that right direction, it is going to ultimately change the anatomy and structure of that animal's face, which is obviously not what we're going for. So you'll see the fur at the bottom of the eye here, it starts to sort of slope away from the eye and then it's going to curve over as it gets towards the right hand side. That's indicating there that you've got that formation of the eye socket underneath. It then slopes away towards the cheek, so we want to make sure that all of these brush marks that we're putting in place are accurate because we are then going to change the anatomy of that animal. And just like I did when I was working on the iris, for the fur around the eye I'm working from dark to light. Now 80% of the time that is usually how I'll be working when I'm using acrylics, but there may be instances, specific fur colours or fur type that require you to work from light to dark. But as I say, for a whole, most of the time it's from dark to light. You're then wanting to have all of those previous layers show through, which I've already mentioned in this video, but it really is important. All of this texture within the fur and the depth has only been achieved because I've been able to show all of those darker layers through that we've been building up gradually. And this is something that can be quite challenging because I like putting the details in. It's one of my favourite parts of any painting. But if that is something that you're struggling with in terms of putting the details in too soon, apply a Gaussian blur to your reference photo, and that will really help to hide all of those details that we're tempted to put in too soon. So you can see that regardless of the subject that we're painting, it is about breaking it into individual layers and not focusing on the details that are at the very top. So the fur details that we would be able to touch if we were to stroke this cat, we want to be ignoring and leaving till the very end. That also goes for things like the whiskers, because we never really know whether or not we finished with a painting until we we step back from it, put it away for a couple of days, and what can happen is if you've already painted the whiskers in and realise that you need to paint more within the fur, you've then got to paint around the whiskers, which just, although it can be done, it can slow down the process. So the whiskers should be one of the last layers to go onto any painting. Now in a few seconds time you'll see that I switch over to my round brush here, and I'm now starting to apply my final glaze. So this is where I'm using a bit of raw sienna, and it's just thinned down with a bit of water to the consistency of milk, and I'm just putting this in a few select places so that I can tint the colour of those whiter hairs that I just put down on my last layer. And this just shows how well glazes work. You can really create such so much extra depth just with one simple glaze. And here is a photo of my finished study. So if you would like to paint this and follow along to this tutorial, the 2-hour version is available on my Patreon now. The reference photo and the line art are also provided over there. And yeah, I really hope this tutorial here on YouTube was of use. If it was, if you could give the video a thumbs up because it really does help. And if you'd like to get notified of future content that I upload, hit the subscribe and the bell button, and I'll be uploading another video here next week. And as always, thank you so much for watching.